The third of our user experience design talks. In this one here, we're going to have a look at reading and how we actually go about reading information and how we can make this as smooth, as efficient a process as we possibly can. Start off with a rather bold claim, but nonetheless a claim that fundamentally is true, but it's maybe one you want to think a little bit about. Making a claim here that reading is unnatural. And you can see here we have a dog reading something. It's not a million miles dissimilar for people. Reading is not a natural activity. And in the next slide, we'll say a little bit about that. But I suppose by definition here, what I mean to say is that if you were to define a spectrum, where over on one side you have as easy as it possibly can be, and the other side you have as difficult as it possibly can be. There'd be some activities that would be very, very easy, some very, very difficult. Reading will be maybe not in the middle, but it will not be over at the very, very easy side. There are lots of other activities that for us are considerably easier than reading. That's important to recognize, to understand, and to factor into the design of our software. So why do we say that reading is unnatural? The reason we say that is that we are not hardwired up to automatically learn how to read or to write. It's not an innate ability. If you compare it, for example, to speaking, to listening, that is an innate ability. So if you have a person and they grow up, doesn't matter whereabouts it is, they will naturally, brains are designed in terms of how we actually grow up and our brain develops to learn speech, to understand, to listen, to use speech. That is something that is effortless and something that we are designed to learn. But that's not the case for reading and writing. If you have somebody that grows up in an environment where they are not given the opportunity to learn how to read or given the opportunity to practice writing, they will not learn reading or writing. And there's a few big picture issues here that if you look at the full sweep of history and you go back a couple of hundred years, it was rare. Vast majority of people could not read or write. It's only been in recent generations when education systems have improved, again, not in all parts of the world, that we take reading and writing for granted. But it's not an innate ability, it is something that we learn over many years of practice through the education systems that we have. That's important because when we think about reading and writing, it's something that requires conscious effort. We have to work at it. And we're trying to create our interfaces so that they are as effortless to use as possible. And that means that we need to think carefully about the reading activities that we request or get our user to engage in. Now, also when we think about reading, generally we have the notion maybe reading a book, like a novel, and you're reading word after word after word and piecing together and imagining the story or whatever. That's one side of reading. There's another side, and the other side is maybe more pertinent to how we access information on a lot of the internet, or if we have an application with lots of words, how we read, so to speak, that screen. Generally speaking, for a lot of the software that we are doing, we are not creating items that the user will read word by word by word. We are creating a structure that will support the user's ability to scan quickly through it, to look and to identify something that's of interest to them, and then to read word by word that particular chunk. So we're talking here about not reading long paragraphs, but having some visual structure that enables scanning to happen. So we tend to scan information looking for words or phrases that catch our eyes. So these are things that we want to find information on this topic, and then we will read it. We do this, a couple of reasons here. We know we don't need to read everything. and we don't want to waste our time and effort. We just want to get to the information that we want, use that information, and then move on to the next one. There are, as I see at the bottom of the aside, there are obvious exceptions to that. A novel was probably the best example here, where this is a piece of text where the user, you can reasonably assume they will read it from the start through to the end, word after word after word. Often isn't true for other sources, even newspaper articles. You might find there that quite often we are inclined to start reading something. If it's not interested, just skip over bits or finish the article. So we are fairly ruthless in terms of reading and demanding suitable return for the effort that we're putting in for the reading in the first place. Okay, so what does this mean for us then as designers? We know that our users require effort. They're likely to scan over things. So what can we control? We actually have quite a lot of control. Obviously, we can choose the words that we put in front of the user. And alongside that, we have a lot of control over how we present those words through the font that we use, through how we position it, how we set it out. And this is important. This particular screen here, you can see 4 fragments of text, exact same words. They only differ based on the font that has been used to communicate those words. And when we're learning to read, what we learn to do is to recognize glyphs, character shapes, and then we learn to automatically clump those characters into word-sized units. So it's a learned ability. We take it for granted, but it's something that we're able to do. And you can see by looking at the different fonts here that some fonts make it easier to group the glyph shapes into words, and some make it easier then to be able to understand, to recognize what that particular word shape is. And ideally, we want to make sure that we pick a font within our application or app or whatever it is that is going to be easy for the user to be able to read. Doesn't hinder it, it's going to reduce the amount of effort required in as far as we can. Another item of control that we have is what is behind the text that we display. And here's a truly awful example of where we have both color and the background that can make it more difficult to actually see what information is presented there. And you might think, oh, I never do anything as bad as this. If we're looking at a gaming app, as we are in this particular module, you do want to think about, well, we're displaying text, but text on top of what? What might be behind the text, and are we content or happy that the user will be able to see the information that we are displaying? And quite often in games you would find that you'll have some text maybe overlaid in a semi-transparent background for the control, so you can more easily see the text and yet get to see through to the game screen in behind it. Another one is about how we align our text. Certainly in Western societies, we read from the left to the right. Not always the case. In other ones, you read from the right to the left. But in all cases, what happens is you start at the beginning of the line, you read through to the end, and we have learned to make an automatic adjustment. When we get to the end, we jump back to the beginning and move down a little bit. It's a learned ability. That's how we learn to read. Now, if we have fully left or right justified text, depending which way we're reading, that process will work beautifully. If we have centered text, it actually disrupts the process ever so slightly. We get to the end of the line, we have to jump back, move down a bit, and then correct to wherever the start of that line is. So it is actually slightly more effort is required to read centered text than it is to read left or right justified text. So in terms of some simple reading guidelines that we might want to bear in mind whenever we're designing our applications, I've got, I think, a total of 6 of them here, all good, solid advice. First one is use an easily readable font. Makes sense. We don't want to disrupt or make it more difficult to read it. That doesn't mean a plain font. There are lots of nice decorative fonts which are well designed that can still support chunking and easy recognition of those chunks. Use a clear and consistent text layout. We should make sure that if we are presenting a clump of information to the user, that we present it in a way that can be easily read or easily parsed, not to have it positioned all over the place. use plain language, or at least a highly consistent vocabulary. We don't want to put in needlessly flowery or obtuse words. We want to pick simple language that gets across what it is we want to get across. Where we need to use technical terminology, just make sure we're consistent in terms of the terms that we use. Omit needless words. So a sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph, no unnecessary sentences. So if you don't need it, if it's not core to the message, omit it. It's just going to get in the way of things. And similar to this, get rid of happy talk. Quite a lot of websites or pages, you'll have some introductory section welcoming the user, or you'll have an overview if we're going to do this and we're going to do that. Cut it out, doesn't matter. So quite often when we are presenting information within apps or online, just give the user the information. They know they'll be welcome. They'll be able to scan through the hierarchy if you've done it well and work out what's on that, if it's going to be of use to them. And ideally, the bottom point here, we should minimize the amount of instructions. We should be trying to design whatever it is we're trying to do in a way that is obvious, where the structures are clear, where the functions are clear, where the processes are clear to the user, where we don't have to have words telling the user to do this or to do that, or if you click on this, this is what will happen. So where possible, we should design out the need to have written text. So our takeaways in this particular one. Reading requires effort. It's easy to take for granted, but there is effort required here. Remember, we're trying to make life as easy as we possibly can for our users, so we want to minimize effort. We can do that by making sure that any text that we use can be easily read, in terms of the font, the layout, the positioning, things like that. And in terms of the actual words that we provide through that text, we should go out of our way to make sure that every single word is genuinely useful. It's only the key core information that we need to provide. And if there's anything else that is superfluous, get rid of it. Simple as that. That's all we want to cover here about the use of text. In the next one, we'll go on to have a look at seeing, what we generally see or don't see on screens.